affirmative case is one of assertion after assertion after assertion, and nowhere do they actually even tell us why English should be the primary language. Nowhere do they tell us how English being the primary language will actually lead to any of the benefits they claim. And even a world that they set up of a developing world stagnant with no growth whatsoever, kept down by a lack of English education, even that is not established clearly. But I'm going to first respond to some of the points that the first speakers made. They talked about the fact that, this isn't, first of all, let's just get some setup out of the way. They've already addressed that it's purely about language, that it's not going to be about culture, that it's still going to allow the second language to be spoken, it's not going to be banned. Right here, they admit something that they intuitively know, that they don't want you to know, and that is that by implementing this motion, it will have an effect on culture. They immediately tell you at the very start that it won't, because they know it's going to be a point that we bring out, they know it's a point in this debate, which I will go into in my substantive portion. But first, let's talk about the fact that nowhere do they prove that why we actually need English. They've told us that these countries have bad GDP, low educational standards, all of these things about how the education system is bad, but none of that will be addressed by making the system in English. A country with a bad education system, with no teachers, with a teacher shortage, with no ability to distribute resources, these problems will not be solved miraculously by making the default language English. As I will address in standard as well, they will actually make them worse. They also talk about bilingualism, but that point also falls down immediately at first, because in a POR response, they can't even tell us why English can't be the second language in bilingualism. They just go back to talking about their supposed benefits, that somehow they assert that English being the default language will lead to miraculous GDP growth, miraculous globalization, all these opportunities that they never had, while at the same time preserving culture. This is fundamentally wrong. 2 points for the House today. First, on the erasure of identity, including culture, and second, on the harm to learning and development of the nation itself. On erasure of culture, language is a fundamental part of culture and identity, and the mandating of English over one's own home language necessarily results in consequences for cultural heritage, and causes a breakdown of family and community identity. The first language that you have, the primary language that you know, is typically the one that you use at a young age through primary and secondary education. We see this when immigrants move over to new countries and they start using that as the language that they think in, the language that they do most everything that they can in. This means that a layer is created between themselves and their cultural background. This also is likely to occur for two reasons. First, because it's an extremely young age. We're talking in the whole main education system from year 1 at 5 years old in primary education all throughout secondary. This means that these people have no prior connection that they built up over time through primary education or in their early childhood with the culture. So they have no reason to keep it, no reason to actually believe and want to keep it in the first place. Additionally, the government is essentially signaling that their home language isn't as important by implementing for English as a primary language. Therefore, they're signaling that, okay, your native heritage language is a secondary thing. Learn English, do what get these opportunities that AFSA that you get before carrying out your own heritage. Now, even if AFSA just a mandate a second language, it's impossible to get the same level of cultural understanding and nuance. 3 reasons for this. First is the fact that your home tongue or your first language, your mother tongue, is simply the one that you think of, right? That you think in. There's certain cultural elements and nuances that you only get from thinking about in that language from a very young age. There's these things that can't be replicated by learning syntax or grammar and stuff like that you necessarily lose when you have a language being switched. Second is the point about there being no incentive. A young person who's learned English for the whole education system has really no incentives to want to learn their home language if their parents don't necessarily push them to, because especially if the government is signaling to them that English is the most important language. And third, because it's simply not used. Even if you have your second language being your home language, it's less likely if you truly go into the world, into develop worlds to build your life, that you'll end up using your native language. So even if you learn it at a young age, you're likely to lose that later on in life.
Point of information?
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that despite their language being so important, nobody would make an effort to speak it outside of school?
No, I'm saying that over time you have this societal shift in values, societal shift towards prioritizing English over the home language. Thank you for pointing that out, because that actually leads me on to the next point about the breakdown of family and community. Yes, it is true that immediately not everyone's going to abandon their home language and never speak of it again and think that it's completely unimportant. But over time, what does this look like for family and community relationships? families are unable to help their children because of the fact that education is switching. And so they might also encourage their children to speak in English or start trying to speak in English at home. This is because they think that if the education system is English, my child needs to learn English, otherwise they'll be disadvantaged. Which means that parents will also have an incentive to make their children speak English and speak English with them at home. This means that you don't get this family push to keep your heritage. You don't get the government push because they've already signaled that English is more important. And you don't get the individual wanting it because it's also being such a young age. Now, even if we take F at their best and assume that these people love their culture a lot, the fact that it's a second language means that you lose these nuances, and as generations go by, you lose more and more of these nuances, right? A person who learns English, but has their native home language parents talking to them, speaking to them, educating about the culture, will absorb some of that. But their children will not absorb as much, their children will absorb even less, and over time, you have a complete degradation of this cultural heritage. Alright. Now let's take you to my harms to learning and development. We've already told you that learning will be harmed because of the fact that we do not have as much community support. But also the government is forced to pour significant resources into adapting the whole education system into English. What this looks like is not finding the best teachers in the nation, but rather teachers in the nation that can speak English and forcing them to educate in their second language, presuming that you serve within the nation. Or you go outside the country, try and find these teachers overseas that have English as their first language, but they have no understanding of the nation and its culture. This exacerbates my first point on cultural loss, but it also leads to two significant harms. You're likely to have to pay a lot of money for these overseas teachers to come to your country, a developing country to teach, right? Which means that you're also likely to not get the best education possible for the money that you have. Two outcomes. You are either, as a country, forced to pay these high quantities of money, expend the cost, and incur a significant opportunity cost in what other things that you can fund. You can't fund as much infrastructure. You can't fund as much healthcare. You can't even fund as many new educational development projects because of the fact that you have to expend so much more money on attracting these international teachers that are not as likely to want to come to a developing country for the fact that it's developing. This money also goes overseas. It's not going to teachers in the country that will contribute back to the economy. These teachers aren't likely to stay in the country forever because they're a foreign nation to them. They're also sending money back home to their families. So this means that money is leaving the economy and the development of the nation is harmed. Or, a second outcome, you're forced to accept subpar teaching or make existing teachers teach in the wrong language. This is just an ironic point because of the fact that if your goal is to make education better, why have these talented, qualified teachers in the nation force them to teach in a language that they're not the most familiar with, adding this additional barrier onto them? Or you're forced to accept these international teachers who are willing to accept a lower wage, who are necessarily probably going to be the worst ones because the best ones are able to accept a higher wage. This also exacerbates a class problem where the best teachers are able to, best schools, most rich private schools are able to source these high salary teachers that other schools can't. Now, even if we take AF at their very best and say that they can get these teachers, they can get the best education, which I've already outlined is pretty well impossible, we still don't prefer this because of the fact that all this development education is going to go not towards developing the country, but towards developing other countries, right? If students are educated in English and then they are told all the time that English is the gateway to opportunities and they move overseas, they're likely to take all their talent, their skill overseas. The brain drain from these developing countries will be immense, and you lose all of the future long-run GDP harms that they've asserted to us, not only because they haven't explained it to us, but also because any harms that they would have are benefits that would have are moving overseas. Proud to oppose.